There's one thing we don't argue with in anesthesia. A flat capnogram means no breath. I watched it fail in operating room 2. I am a consultant anesthesiologist at St. James's Hospital in Dublin, with more than a decade in thoracic and major vascular work. Winter in that building has a particular sound: filtered air, faint hum from the scavenging system, the steady tick of an arterial waveform printer, the metronome of infusion pumps. Rules keep that soundscape predictable. Chief among them in my field is simple. If the capnography trace is flat, the patient is not ventilating, and if it stays flat despite our efforts, the patient is not alive. The machine does not lie about carbon dioxide. The case began as many do. Early morning list. Operating room 2. Blue drapes. Warming mattress already set to medium. Blood bank units verified and ready on standby. The patient was a middle-aged man with a large abdominal aortic aneurysm that had started to press on his back and appetite. He had the kind of face you see often in vascular theater. Tired eyes, skin with tobacco stains that never quite wash off. A vascular tree that had been punished by years of pressure. He had been optimized by our colleagues on the ward, and his pre-op assessment pointed to expected risks: hard blood pressure, old myocardial scar, lungs that did not forgive errors. I placed a radial arterial line under ultrasound in the pre-op bay, secured a large bore intravenous catheter, and checked that the cell saver circuit was primed. In theater, after standard checks, we pre-oxygenated until the end-tidal oxygen rose to the safe band, induced with a balanced technique, confirmed tracheal placement with a sharp square capnogram, and began controlled ventilation. Baseline numbers settled into the usual pattern: end-tidal carbon dioxide in the mid-30s, oxygen saturation near perfection, mean arterial pressure respectable with a touch of vasoactive support. The processed EEG index lay in the 50s, and I adjusted volatile agent and opioid to keep it there. The patient's temperature drifted downward as expected, and then stabilized with warming. The first small oddity came from the infusion pump logs. One of the syringe drivers reported a brief, impossible pause, a recorded gap of several seconds where the noradrenaline should have been running, but had not. The line was patent, the plunger position unchanged, the pressure alarm quiet. I power cycled the driver and swapped to a spare syringe. The arterial trace did not flinch. It looked like a software hiccup, the kind that writes an entry the body ignores. I noted it in the anesthetic record and moved on. Cross-clamp time brings a predictable shift. Surgeons announce, clamps go on, venous return changes, the heart protests and then learns a new rhythm. We doubled the vasopressor, watched the end-tidal carbon dioxide climb a hair as perfusion altered, and kept ventilation steady. The witness object in this story, the capnograph, drew its serrated rectangles in the calm way a river draws ripples on a still day. I make a habit of reading it not just for height, but for shape. The alveolar plateau, the slope that hints at bronchospasm, the rapid fall that tells of a leak. It looked ordinary. When clamps come off, the second predictable shift arrives. Washed-out metabolites surge back. The heart takes an insult. Pressure drops, sometimes catastrophically. We prepared for it. Calcium drawn up, bicarbonate ready, vasopressors at the elbow. When release happened, pressure fell faster than the cascade can be named. The arterial trace narrowed to a thread, then flattened to noise. The plethysmograph went blank. I told my hands what they already knew and started chest compressions while turning up vasopressors to the ceiling of sanity. The ventilator switched to manual bagging under my palm, with firm chest rise and a capnogram that dropped to a low line with tiny teeth riding near zero. In resuscitation, time becomes a soft thing, but logs anchor it. We gave repeated adrenaline at fixed intervals, pushed calcium and bicarbonate, checked for reversible causes. The surgeon's hands held still, lines clamped, field packed. We transitioned to open cardiac massage. Ultrasound showed no filling, no movement that meant life. The capnograph stayed nearly flat, with little quivers caused by my bagging. The end-tidal carbon dioxide did not rise into the reassuring band that suggests return of circulation during chest compressions. It hovered low, like a voice too far away to hear. After many cycles, we reached the place every team dreads, but is trained to find with clarity. No cardiac activity on ultrasound, no palpable pulses, invasive or otherwise, no perfusing rhythm on the monitor, only electrical silence interspersed with slow, wide complexes that had no pressure behind them. The patient was warmed, oxygenated via the tube, ventilated by hand. Airway was confirmed. Lines were patent. There was no hidden bleed we could access without destroying what chance remained. The capnography trace, my barometer of reality, was a shallow coastal tide. We did a final pulse check with ultrasound to avoid fooling ourselves with wish. Nothing presented itself as reversible. The room, full of motion and sound for so long, moved towards stillness. There is a protocol for stopping, and we followed it. Each person spoke their part into the record in a dry cadence, each box on the resuscitation sheet marked. I kept my hand on the bag valve device longer than usual, giving steady breaths while the surgeon closed vessels and packed the abdomen to a point that would bring order if order returned. The processed EEG index was meaningless by then. Noise on noise. The arterial line gave only artifact. The pulse oximeter waited like a sensor in an empty room. I do not enjoy silence in theater. Monitors fill silence with meaning. When they become quiet, the space between sounds grows. The scavenging hum stayed. The warming device whirred. Everything else for a long space was quiet. We stopped compressions. Hands came off the chest. We stood in that necessary gap where action no longer helps, and yet we watch, because watching is a duty, and because of stories we do not admit to believing. The witness object broke the silence first. A tiny deflection appeared on the capnogram, a breath-shaped rise where there should be none. I had the bag in my hand and knew the difference between my squeeze and a patient's exhalation. The volume of my ventilation had not changed. The shape was not the artifact wave you see when someone bumps the line. It had the soft plateau that comes from alveoli emptying. Then another rise came, a hair higher. The end tidal number ticked upward by a margin too small to claim and too real to ignore. The arterial trace was still nonsense. The pulse oximeter showed nothing. The ultrasound, when placed, showed no organized beating. And yet, breath by breath, the capnograph began to speak. I checked every connection. The water trap was clear. The sampling line was intact, not kinked. The tube was secured. There was no leak that could mock a plateau. The patient's chest rose only when I squeezed the bag. But the carbon dioxide during those breaths changed its profile, growing toward the band we associate with metabolism and circulation, not just dead space. Something in the loop had moved from dead to not entirely dead. We had already marked the point at which the protocol would have us stop. That line had been crossed. The team looked to me, not for words, but for actions that would either honor the rule or question it. The rule says a flat capnogram in this context confirms the end. But the capnogram was not flat. It was coherent. climbing from near zero to a level that, in other circumstances, makes us nod and relax. The rest of the screen denied what the capnograph claimed. The heart did not show us a waveform. The arterial line did not show a pressure. The pulse oximeter refused to find a pulse. Only the capnograph delivered a message. I restarted compressions. We gave another dose of adrenaline. We checked glucose, potassium, calcium again. We drew a blood gas through the arterial catheter, even though it behaved like a straw in an emptied cup. The analyzer later would tell a story of acidosis so deep it reads like a misprint, of lactate that belonged to a different species, of oxygen content that laughed at the fraction of inspired oxygen we were delivering. While we moved, the capnograph stayed above the line that separates hope from ritual. The checklist was complete. The pronouncement had been made in the record as per policy. The ethical weight of restarting after that moment is felt in the chest more than the head. I felt it, and I felt the weight of my name under the line that would explain why we continued. The witness object on the anesthesia machine, the one device in the room that doesn't care about our feelings, was testifying to a fact. Carbon dioxide was leaving the lungs in a pattern that implied perfusion, however thin. For years, the capnograph has been my compass. It confirms tube placement. It warns of circuit disconnections. It tells me how metabolism and circulation dance. When it is flat and stays flat in a scenario like this, the story is over. In this room, on this winter morning, the capnograph asked me to doubt the ending. We reran the ultrasound. The image showed what looked like minimal, chaotic flicker, not organized beats, not a rhythm that could lift blood up through valves, but not nothing. I increased the ventilatory rate, not to chase a number, but to give a framework if a pressure wave emerged. The end tidal carbon dioxide rose a little more, a stepwise climb too clean to be random. We had a number and a shape without the vital signs that should sit beside them. The circulation chart remained stubbornly blank. The cardiac monitor refused to display a rhythm anyone could call perfusing. The rule said the room was done. The witness said otherwise. My reputation, our protocol, and a family down the corridor waiting for an answer pressed in on the same point. It felt like standing on the threshold of a door that is meant to close and hearing movement on the other side. The end tidal carbon dioxide should reflect circulation. The ultrasound should agree. They did not. But the capnogram did not match the silence. The first action after the capnogram rose was to lock the room into audit mode. That meant speaking less and logging more, touching nothing that was not necessary, and building a chain of facts we could defend later. I asked the circulating nurse to note exact times from the wall clock. In anesthesia, we live by 3 clocks: the ventilator timer, the infusion pump log, and the human record. I wanted all 3 to speak. At about 5 minutes after compressions had ended, the capnograph showed a small but coherent plateau. I resumed compressions and called for ultrasound. The probe slid across the draped chest, gel pooling in the surgical field light. The image showed fine, disorganized shimmer in the ventricles. No true thickening, no valve motion with purpose. The arterial line stayed mute, the transducer reading only noise. Despite that, each manual breath produced a carbon dioxide trace that climbed 1 notch and held its shape like a proper alveolar plateau, not a sawtooth artifact. We stepped through reversible causes as if reading a prayer. Hypoxia was addressed with maximal oxygen. Hypovolemia had been blunted by cell-saver returns and crystalloids, and there was no reservoir left to squeeze. Tension physiology was unlikely with an open abdomen and flat lungs. Tamponade would have shown on ultrasound, and it did not. Toxins were not in play. Temperature was low but actively corrected. Electrolytes had been challenged with calcium and bicarbonate. With each step, the capnogram behaved as if circulation were present, while every other instrument argued the opposite. Evidence beat one: arterial blood gas. We drew a sample from the arterial catheter, even though the waveform was unreadable. The gas analyzer later reported profound acidosis, a carbon dioxide level inconsistent with efficient ventilation, and an oxygen level that did not reflect the fraction we were delivering. The lactate was extreme. None of that surprised me. What mattered was the trend. We drew a second gas 10 minutes later. The pH shifted a fraction toward normal. The carbon dioxide climbed modestly. The lactate nudged the same way. Trend implies flow. Flow implies some perfusion. Yet there was no pulse on the monitor and no mechanical activity on ultrasound that would account for it. Evidence beat two: capnogram morphology audit. I saved the capnograph waveform segments to the machine's memory for transfer later. The shape had changed from dead space spikes to a square plateau with a gentle sloping phase, the kind you learn to read as alveoli emptying over time. The end tidal values rose into a band that, in a routine case, signals that metabolism and circulation are in conversation. I verified the sampling line by swapping it for a spare and replacing the water trap. The trace remained true. Evidence beat three: venous gases from the central line. We pulled a venous sample from the central catheter. The oxygen saturation in that sample was so low it was almost theoretical, and the carbon dioxide was high. But the difference between that and the arterial sample, small as it was, suggested a gradient. No gradient can exist without transport, even if that transport is sluggish and chaotic. We widened support. Vasopressors ran at the top of conventional dosing. The cell saver provided another bowl of returned red cells. The surgeons controlled every bleeder they could see, packed judiciously, and left nothing untied. I adjusted ventilation to avoid hyperventilation that could drop carbon dioxide too low, because the capnogram was now both a witness and a compass. If it started to fall without a mechanical reason, it might mean our tenuous thread was snapping. Evidence beat four: processed EEG index and raw trace. While EEG indices are not designed for this phase, the raw signal gave us something: a low amplitude, noisy pattern with brief bursts that were not artifact. It was not wakefulness, but it was not the flat inactivity one expects after prolonged low flow. We marked those bursts in the record, synchronizing them with the capnogram rises. There was no perfect alignment, but the bursts became slightly more frequent as end-tidal carbon dioxide crept upward. Correlation is not causation, but the timing was not meaningless. Evidence beat five: echocardiography with a second operator. I asked for a fresh set of eyes. Another anesthesiologist arrived and took the ultrasound probe. He swept the windows I had swept. He saw what I had seen: fine myocardial quiver, sometimes called ventricular standstill with residual electrical noise, but no organized contraction. He ruled out tamponade again. He did not find a wall motion that could move a measurable column of blood. He looked at me with the expression we reserve for poor odds. Then he looked at the capnogram, and his expression shifted to confusion. At the midpoint of that drawn-out hour, we reached a decision node. We had recorded a pronouncement according to protocol. Continuing resuscitative efforts after that point is not routine and comes with consequences. I placed a plain sentence into the anesthetic record to justify the deviation. Continued ventilatory end-tidal carbon dioxide consistent with perfusion despite absent invasive pressure and absent Dopplerable pulses. Trend toward improvement on consecutive blood gases. Ultrasound with non-organized motion, but not complete standstill. It was the most uncomfortable line I have ever signed, because it said we were believing a device against the chorus of others. We asked the perfusion team to stand by with an extracorporeal circuit, knowing full well that the window for that option might have already closed. The surgeons weighed surgical reopening for direct cardiac massage against the risk of tearing already fragile tissue. We kept to compressions at a slow, deliberate cadence to avoid losing what little the capnogram told us we had. The infusion pump logs continued to misbehave. Another syringe driver recorded a brief pause without an alarm. We replaced it as well. Later, biomedical engineering would confirm micro-interruptions in the power bus of that pump model under heavy draw. At the time, it felt like static on a radio when you are trying to hear a verdict. I returned to basics. Airway secured, cuff pressure checked, tube position reconfirmed with bronchoscopy to ensure it had not migrated into a main stem. Breathing, manual ventilation with steady volumes, no auto peep, no bronchospasm on auscultation. Circulation, compressions maintained, vasopressors at maximum safe dose, calcium and bicarbonate titrated to serial gases, glucose normal. Temperature, forced air warming and fluid warmer, core measured via bladder probe. Electrolytes, rechecked with point-of-care analyzers and adjusted in small, careful increments. Around that time, the capnograph rose another small step. It was not dramatic. It was simply undeniable. The end tidal value crossed into the lower bound of what we call acceptable for an anesthetized patient. The alveolar plateau smoothed. The inspiratory baseline returned to true zero between breaths. The device that only means breath began to suggest blood. But our other screens refused to follow. The arterial line stayed flat. The pulse oximeter hunted in a sea of noise. The ultrasound image, now reviewed by a third pair of eyes, still did not display a stroke volume anyone could swear to. Here's the second contradiction, clean and sharp. The capnogram and blood gas trends said perfusion. The invasive pressure and echocardiography said none. We considered causes that could reconcile the split reality. One possibility was auto-resuscitation, a delayed return of spontaneous circulation that sometimes occurs after compressions stop, mediated by trapped air and slow venous return. But we were compressing again. Another was that chest compressions alone were moving enough blood through the lungs to generate carbon dioxide clearance without producing a measurable arterial waveform, especially with severe vasoplegia after clamp release. A third was an equipment cascade, a damped arterial line, a pulse oximeter overwhelmed by vasoconstriction and cold, an ultrasound window compromised by gas and dressings. All three could be true at once. None felt fully satisfying. I asked the team to pause compressions for a brief ultrasound check synchronized with the ventilator. We stopped for a handful of seconds. The capnogram continued to show a plateau during my manual breaths, not the tiny dead space spikes one sees with pure chest wall movement. The ultrasound showed a hint of thickening with each breath, as though intrathoracic pressure changes were coaxing the heart. When compressions resumed, the ultrasound went back to shimmering chaos, and the capnograph rose a fraction higher. We debated extracorporeal support again. The call was not about resources. It was about whether the patient's physiology had any reserve left to make it worth moving heaven and earth. The surgeons and I agreed. If we could create even a whisper of arterial pressure, we would commit. We re-leveled the transducer, flushed the line, and switched to a fresh pressure kit in case damping was fooling us. The new kit displayed the same flatness. 20 more minutes of disciplined work passed. The capnograph held steady. The gases trended the same cautious way. The EEG continued to show sparse bursts. The room stayed quiet except for the sounds of a team moving with purpose at a lower volume. The family waited outside, unaware that our instruments were arguing with one another and forcing us to choose a witness to trust. Then, without drama, the arterial line drew a tiny notch. One breath later, it drew another. A third came higher, forming the faintest outline of a waveform. The pulse oximeter found a trace in the ear probe, then lost it, then found it again. Ultrasound returned to the right window and saw a thin, real motion at the mitral valve. The capnograph, which had led the way, did not change much at all. It had simply been right earlier. We declared return of spontaneous circulation cautiously, because declaring it too soon can make people sloppy. We kept vasopressors high. We asked for a formal echocardiography consult to repeat what we had seen, to document function and rule out mechanical causes we could treat. We arranged for critical care to receive the patient on a ventilator with invasive monitoring and continued warming. We placed a note in the record that explained, without bravado, that the capnograph had guided continued efforts beyond the point at which protocol would normally end them. The echocardiography consultant arrived and performed a structured study. The report described severely depressed function, global hypokinesis, no tamponade, and no gross mechanical disruption. It also documented a weak but present stroke volume. The blood gas drawn just after that showed a pH that had crept further toward survivable, a carbon dioxide consistent with low flow, and a lactate still towering but edging down. None of this promised recovery. It only said that the story had not ended when the rule said it had. We moved the patient to intensive care with the abdomen temporarily closed, lines secured, warming continued, sedation maintained, and vasopressors titrated. The capnogram in transport stayed honest, and I found myself looking at it more than any other screen, as if it were a colleague that had earned new trust. On the way out, I signed the addendum in the anesthetic chart that would spark what came next. A local morbidity and mortality review, a policy discussion about pronouncement timing in the operating room, and a re-education session on the limits of any single absolute. The monitors in the theater dimmed as the porters pushed the bed through the doors. The room filled again with the ordinary noises of cleaning and instrument counting. The witness object sat on its cart, screen blank now, quietly correct. We had followed the algorithm to its last line. The next page had written itself. The handover to intensive care was precise, clipped, and almost cautious. The critical care consultant listened, hands resting on the side rail, as I described the contradiction. A capnograph that rose when the heart was still, a series of gases that trended toward life in the absence of pressure. The ICU nurses recorded each line of infusion, each syringe concentration, each blood gas timestamp. They did not comment on the pronouncement already written in the anesthetic record, but they saw it. Every note becomes part of the patient's permanent trail. In the first 24 hours, the patient lived tethered to machines. The arterial pressure remained fragile, dependent on maximal vasopressors and fluids. Ventilation was protective but permissive, accepting higher carbon dioxide to avoid lung trauma. Renal support began that evening, with dialysis lines placed and continuous hemofiltration started to manage the acid-base chaos. Temperature reached normothermia with active warming. Neurological status was impossible to gauge. Sedation was maintained to allow the organs to stabilize before any attempt at assessment. The family was told the truth in layers, that circulation had stopped, that by every visible measure the patient had died, that only a single device had continued to suggest life, and that resuscitation had been prolonged on that basis. They were given no promises of recovery, only the fact that there was still a pulse, still numbers on a screen. Families do not hear nuance in those moments. They hear life or death. Their eyes searched mine for certainty. I could not give it. On the second day, ICU recorded a narrow escape. Blood pressure held on slightly reduced vasopressors. Urine output returned in drops, and lactate, though still high, edged downward. The capnogram, once again, was steady and coherent. For the first time since theater, the arterial waveform looked like a living signal. The EEG remained burst-suppressed, an ominous sign for brain recovery, but not a declaration of absence. By the fifth day, the patient developed pneumonia, unsurprising given massive transfusion, open surgery, and long resuscitation. Antibiotics were escalated, ventilator settings adjusted, and infection markers logged. The kidneys remained on dialysis. The liver numbers climbed and then plateaued. The brain showed no purposeful movement when sedation was lightened. The ICU note used the phrase, "neurological prognosis poor." On the 10th day, the heart arrested again. This time, the capnograph agreed. Ventilation produced only dead space spikes, no alveolar plateau. The ultrasound showed no movement. The gases trended only downward. We stopped after 30 minutes, with no contradiction to hold us. The patient's death was certified, again, this time without dissent. The institutional review began within a month. The Morbidity and Mortality Conference brought anesthesiologists, surgeons, intensivists, biomedical engineers, and ethicists into the same room. I presented the case step by step: induction, clamp, collapse, pronouncement, the capnograph's defiance, the continuation, the second collapse. I displayed waveforms, blood gas results, infusion logs, and ultrasound clips. The room was silent in the way professionals go silent when one of their absolutes has been questioned. The biomedical engineers confirmed the capnograph had not malfunctioned. The sampling line was intact, the analyzer calibrated, the data stored correctly. The syringe driver pauses, irrelevant to the central phenomenon, were attributed to a known electrical fault later corrected by manufacturer recall. The arterial line damping was ruled out after repeat kit replacement had shown the same results. There was no equipment explanation that could fully account for the sequence. The working hypothesis adopted was auto-resuscitation, sometimes called the Lazarus phenomenon. Spontaneous return of circulation after prolonged resuscitation has ceased. It is described rarely in literature, often dismissed as artifact, but it cannot be excluded here. Another possibility raised was that chest compressions and residual contractility, combined with profound vasoplegia, produced carbon dioxide clearance before arterial line signal could register. None of these theories sat comfortably, but all were better than claiming mystery. Policy changed. As of spring the following year, St. James's Hospital adopted a new requirement. When cessation of resuscitation is declared in the operating room, end-tidal carbon dioxide must be monitored for at least 10 minutes afterward, and any sustained alveolar plateau must trigger a reconsideration of stopping. A quiet clause was added. Pronouncements must be made not by a single individual, but confirmed by a second consultant when feasible. Personally, the cost was less visible but deeper. For weeks after, every case I ran was shadowed by the question: do I trust my instruments, or do I trust my rules? I checked capnographs compulsively. I interrogated arterial lines more than necessary. My colleagues, though supportive, treated me as the one who had almost signed off a living patient. That reputation can be both a burden and a protection. The family received a formal apology, not for the actions taken, but for the uncertainty imposed. They accepted it quietly, though their grief was doubled, once on the day of surgery, once again 10 days later. Years on, I still teach juniors that capnography is the most reliable witness in anesthesia. But when I say it, I pause before the word absolute. I no longer use that word. The case is closed in the hospital records. It is not closed in my head. The capnograph rose against silence. That trace is still stored in the machine's archive, a line of serrated rectangles that do not fit in any protocol. I sometimes open it, not to relive, but to remind myself that medicine is written in probabilities, never certainties. The rule was simple. Flat capnogram means no breath, no life. That winter morning, it failed. And when absolutes fail, they do not mend easily.